Hello everyone, welcome back. So in this short segment, I'd like to discuss with you one aspect that is certainly important for those who want to understand and document social dynamics, social inequalities, as well as for those who are engaged in social change. Well, the topic of this segment is intersectionality. And I'd like to briefly discuss with you how quantitative methods can help us in this endeavor of documenting and understanding intersectionality and eventually bring novel evidence and findings to support political claims and policy demands. So let me share my screen with you. So as discussed in previous segments, one of the strong aspects of quantitative methodologies is that quantitative methods and statistics, they provided a range of useful tools to process large amounts of data and to also capture and portray trends, right? But because of this use of quantitative methods to provide big pictures, and more often than not, when we see quantitative data in the media or in policy reports and so on, it's not unusual for us to find references to grand means, large patterns, without proper care to understand how different layers may be intertwined under those findings being reported, right? So from this is not difficult to infer that, well, quantitative tools are not exactly appropriate to understand and to document intersectionality, or intersectionality is just ignored in the process and the analysis of large amounts of data, right? Because, as I mentioned, because of this usual focus on the broad trends and average. But in this video, I'd like to claim that this perception or this attitude is quite incorrect. My argument here, and that I want to share with you, is that on the contrary, quantitative methods are very well suited to explore and document differences between or differences among groups across a range of indicators, variables, features, and so on. And quantitative methods are also ready to provide us analytic procedures that allow us to test or to check whether certain factors interact or not, or reinforce or not each other in the way they influence a certain outcome, right? So let me give you a simple example here, right? In this segment. So there are different ways one can use quantitative methods to assess or to understand certain processes or how certain processes are observed, right? When we are doing some quantitative analysis, one of the things we can do is to examine, is to assess whether or not certain characteristics of an individual or of a town of a group are related to certain outcomes. So we can check, for instance, we can document and examine empirically whether or not, for instance, education has an impact on income. This is a silly example, but for the purpose of this video, this is enough. So we can check whether two variables are related or not to each other, right? And in social processes, there are more than one variable, right? That, or more than one dimension, more than one aspect that are related to a process or an outcome of interest, right? So we can have multiple variables helping us to understand a certain phenomenon, right? Social factors are causal, right? So using quantitative methods, we can also understand whether the influence of different factors on a process or an outcome or a feature of interest, if these different factors, they have independent, separate, unique influences, or whether these different factors, they interact with each other in a way that one can amplify or reinforce their effects or impacts on what we want to understand, what we want to explain. And this later aspect that I mentioned is very well suited to understand intersectionality. We can examine how, say, age and race may impact on, for instance, income, and whether age has a different impact for one ethnic group or another ethnic group, right? So let me give you a simple example on how this may operate. Let's say that in a recent report, the British government said that the average salary in the United Kingdom is £60,000 a year. Let me just tell you, this is before I proceed, this is fake data. I invented those numbers, but they are very well suited to illustrate the example I want to bring, and this example is not very far from reality. So let's say that the average salary in the United Kingdom is £60,000 a year. Okay, this is not telling us any difference by education, ethnicity, race, origin, gender, etc. Right? But we can analyze this data and we can break this average down for different groups. Let's say that we want first to examine the differences between, or average differences in salaries for females and males, right? And when we do this analysis, well, we see that the original £60,000 a year masks an important and big difference when we compare males and females in the UK. We see when we go deeper in the analysis, we find that there is an important discrepancy for the average salary of male workers and female workers. In this example that I created here, males on average, of course, there are higher and lower weights, as explained in the previous videos, and how these distributions of weights may operate. But well, in this example, let's say that when we look for different gender groups, we find that on average, males make around £73,000 a year, and females lag substantially behind with an average salary of £51,000 per year. Again, these are average, but they are important signals, right? That there are, in general, processes leading to different returns for male and female workers. But one could say, well, males on average have higher salaries because males in general have a higher education, average higher level of education. So if we look at this argument would say, if you look at the average salary per level of education, we would see that women with, say, a university degree would have similar salaries to a male with a university degree, right? And the differences or the explanation why males make higher salaries than females is that more males have higher education degrees and postgraduate degrees, right? This is an argument, which we know that it's not exactly correct. We know that on average, women have higher levels of educational achievements than men. But let's say that this is still a valid argument for us to consider and examine, right? So, okay, from the initial average, where a worker in the UK would make on average £60,000 per year, from there we found out that males make substantially higher average incomes compared to females. But then there is the question about the impact of education, right? And then once we account for education, the differences between males and females would be then explained, right? But let's see in this example, what would be the average income or the average yearly wage for males and females according to levels of education. So let's say that a male with lesser than a secondary education would be making on average £25,000 a year. But when you look at males with secondary education, complete secondary education, we would notice an important increase in their incomes, with male workers with secondary education making about £45,000 a year. And for male workers with an university or a college degree, their average income would climb and be around £70,000 per year. And for those male workers who have a PG degree, like a master's, a PhD, etc., those males would be on average making salaries even higher of around £90,000 per year. So let's see whether the process is observed among female workers. Well, when you look only at female workers and we start disentangling the average levels of income per level of education, let's see what we find. Well, in this example, females with lesser than a secondary education would be making £20,000 a year. Female workers with complete secondary education would be making £39,000 per year. Female workers with a college degree, a university degree, would be making around £55,000 per year on average. And as we observed for men, female workers with a PG degree, like a master's or a PhD, would be making higher salaries than those with only an university degree. And in this case, females with postgraduate education would be making £60,000 per year. In common, we see that for both groups, the higher the achieved education, the higher will be the expected salary, right? But we see that for males and females, the starting point is different, and the additional return in salary per degree achieved tends to be higher for males than for females. We see here in this graph is just a representation of the data in this tree here, right? I just plotted this so we can have a visual device to better see the discrepancies of return per education in terms of salary for males and females. We see that not only females on average make lower salaries than males, but the gap in the average salary for males and females tends to increase. It gets wider and wider when we look at professions, for instance, that demand more qualifications. So this is one simple example of how quantitative methods can help us to understand and document processes that reinforce each other, right? So females not only make lesser, in general, lesser salaries than males, but they also experience smaller increases in their salaries once they achieve further credentials or more education degrees, right? Uh, a question that emerges from this analysis, for instance, could be, would this discrepancy remains after we account for other relevant factors that may also impact on job market, income, returns, and so on? The answer is when we are analyzing this type of data, we can do almost endless analysis of like how different processes affect different groups in a population, for instance. Here we are using gender, males and females, but we could be talking about immigrants and non-immigrants, different ethnicities, etc. The only limit that we have in quantitative methods for how fine-grained our analysis can be is the data we have available. If we have rich data sets with more indicators, more social factors, and so on, we can look for these results in a very detailed manner. We can see how, for instance, in this example, whether age also increases or not the effect of education on income for men and women, right? So if we have the proper data to analyze these issues, if we have sufficient data, we can go as fine-grained and as detailed as you can to understand how different factors and different dimensions in the social life interact with each other, right? Which is what intersectionality aims to achieve, right? How to see different aspects go together and create their own specific dynamics for different groups. When we look as the different tools that we can use in quantitative analysis, there is a wide range of tools that you could use to understand intersectionality. But even regression, which is the most common more advanced technique for data analysis, even regression models, as simple as they may be in some cases, they are sufficient to contribute to some understanding and to bring novel findings to the understanding of intersectionality. For instance, in the left panel, we have what would be the standard type of regression models. We want to explain income, and we are basically considering how age influences income, how birthplace, how race, how education, how these different factors, for instance, among many others, of course, can impact one's chances in the job market. This type of model, we can discuss this in more detail later, but this type of regression model treats variables almost like a horse race. We are just looking at these different variables separately and how each one would explain a share of income, how individuals with different ages have different incomes of different birthplaces, different races, different educations, right? This is not exactly what those interested in intersectionality are looking for. But if we look, for instance, at the panel on the right side, we find more appropriate models to understand intersectionality. We have the same, you see, we have the same, here we have the same variables, apologies, for to understand income dynamics, but there is an important difference in this second model. we see that here we have what is called in methods an interaction. Basically, we are looking at how race contributes to understand differences in income. For instance, regardless of education, we have the impact of education on income, regardless of race. So what would be the quote unquote pure effect of each one? But we know this is not how social processes work. So we can include how education work for different groups. We can look at how, for instance, education impacts on income for whites, for blacks, from Indians, from Pakistanis, from Brazilians, from Italians, and so on. Here I'm going beyond a race, I'm including some nationalities as well, but you understood the idea. We can check how, for instance, in this case, education have a different effect on income for different groups. And the same could be done for other variables. We could, for instance, check the differential impact of race for different age groups, for different genders, from different birthplaces, and so on. So my point here is to demonstrate that, or at least to argue that contrary to some understandings of how quantitative methods could not be useful for us to have a better understanding of intersectionality, I reinforce what I said before. Quantitative methods are well suited to help us to explore and document intersectionality in many ways. And in using appropriate tools to assess from a quantitative, from a statistical perspective, using the appropriate tools to understand or to analyze quantitative data, we can bring novel, relevant, robust evidence for debates, to support political demands, and to guide policy recommendations. So in this segment, that's what my intention, to demonstrate with using a silly example that I just created, but to show that how this technique can be useful to understand how different processes may operate for different groups, how different processes can lead to the systematic underappreciation or under performance in terms of wage or other indicators of interest using quantitative data, right? Of course, quantitative methods only provide us the technical tools to process large amounts of data so we can explain or at least document these different dynamics. What will guide what are the relevant groups to be considered, the different variables that may eventually have different effects for different groups, will all come from your previous knowledge, from theoretical references, and so on. So statistics and quantitative methods will not be the golden response for these questions. You have to bring your questions. These methods help you to understand what's going on, but all these analyses will be, and they have to be, and they must be guided by theory, by, again, previous knowledge, and by your curiosity and willing to understand the differential impact of social processes across different groups in a society. So with this, I will end this segment, and I see you again very soon. Bye.